Gosh, well, first of all, thank you all for coming. Thanks, Nancy. It's been a pleasure to work with you. And Felicia, I love everything about Haven and had such a fun experience during my time there. And so I just really appreciate it. I'll never forget walking around and you showing me some photographs of your own family story on the walls there at Haven. And I feel like we started maybe talking about this, the idea of a book club event then. So I'm so happy to be here now with you all. So I will tell you a little bit about my book. I'm curious to know, are there folks who haven't read it, or I'm gonna like have a spoiler alert? Has anybody read it? Is there anybody who's worried about spoiler alerts? Now's the time to.
Juan almost finished.
I didn't finish it yet, but I feel like I showed up and you can spoil it.
The title spoils it a little bit, right?
Yeah, I assume the stories that you know are people that survived.
There you go. Yes. So in a nutshell, certainly this is the story of my grandfather and his siblings, a family from Rodom, Poland, central Poland. And it follows them as they scatter at the start of the Second World War on a twofold mission to survive first, right? And also to reunite. And a lot of people find it very interesting that as a child growing up, I actually had no idea about this chapter of my grandfather's history. Here I am at age 1 with my grandfather, who I call Papa and who I knew as Eddie, because when he got to the States, he Americanized his name from Addie, which was short for Adolf. So you can imagine how eager he was to get rid of that name. So from Addie Kirk to Eddie Kurtz, and in Polish, Kurc, which we pronounce Kirk here in the States, is pronounced Kurtz. So he spells it Courts, which is the similar phonetically to how he would have pronounced it in Poland. My grandfather and my grandmother, Caroline, who you meet at the tail end of the book, lived about a mile from us where our house was in small town Massachusetts. And so we saw each other quite a lot. Meals, birthdays, at any occasion. I adored spending time at my grandparents' house. And yet my grandfather's Polish history past was not, Polish Holocaust past was just not a part of our conversation, just wasn't something that we talked about. I would discover that piece of his story at age 15, which was actually a year after he had died. And that was thanks to a high school English assignment called an iSearch. And that was before I had anything to do with phones. I meant me. And so the assignment was to go out and to learn a little bit about your roots by interviewing a family member. So I realized I actually didn't know too much about my grandfather's history. So I sat with my grandmother, Caroline, and this was the paper that came of it. And it was over the course of that hour-long interview that I discovered that my grandfather was from Rodom, that he was one of 5 siblings. I learned that he, at the start of the war, that he grew up Jewish. That part I didn't know either. And that at the start of the war, he was living in France, and that he was the only one of his family members who managed to escape Europe. And my grandmother was a little bit fuzzy on the details, but she explained that he found a way out of Marseille and eventually ended up in Rio. And she also mentioned that the ship that left Marseille, that was bound for Rio, he met a young Czechoslovakian refugee aboard that ship, and they were engaged to be married, actually. Luckily for my mom and for me, that didn't work out, right? But she remembered her as Elizabeth and spoke kindly of her. And then I said, well, what about, so he arrives in Brazil at the start of the war. What about his family back in Poland? I knew enough in my Holocaust studies that the odds were severely against them. And she said, like your grandfather, I met your grandfather's family after the war, and like your grandfather, they rarely spoke about that time. So there wasn't so much she could share sort of on the greater Kirk family story. So fast forward, this was 95, fast forward to the year 2000, and I was graduating from UVA. Here I am here, and in this photograph is my grandmother, Caroline, the matriarch. Can you guys see my pointer? Yeah. Great. And Felicia. So for those of you who remember, Felicia was a year old at the start of the war, so my grandfather's niece. And so my mother invited her cousins for a family reunion at our home in Massachusetts. She's one of 10 on her father's side, and they live in France and Brazil and Israel, California, Vermont, Miami, all across the states. And they all immediately agreed to come. And with spouses and children, I think at our peak, what were we, like 32 in all?
Wow.
And it was this amazing week where we got to know one another. I met cousins I'd never met before. There were 4 languages being spoken at once, always music being played, all different kinds of food being prepared. And it was so fun. It was so fun. And one night at that reunion, I wandered out to the back porch where my mom and her cousins were sitting, and sat down at a table and started listening to some stories that were being told. And I realized that they were stories that were unlike any I'd ever heard before. Jose talked about how he was born in Siberia, and yet he had no idea why his parents had been sent there. He just knew that he was born in the dead of the Siberian winter on the floor of the gulag. And he said his mother would tell him when he would wake up as a baby, his eyes would be frozen shut. It was so cold. And she would coax his eyes open with her breast milk. Anna talks about how her parents her mother hiked over the Austrian Alps to safety at the end of the war. She happened to be pregnant at the time with her brother Ricardo. Victor talked about how his parents, who were in love since their young teenage years, couldn't wait any longer to get married. So after the war had begun, they found a rabbi to come out of hiding and had this like extremely dangerous and illegal ceremony in a blacked out house in Lvov. I heard about an escape from the ghetto, a disguised circumcision. Like the stories just, they were mind-boggling to me. They were remarkable. And I remember sitting there thinking, how have I never heard these before? And then how has no one taken the time to write them down? And I can't say I knew that person to write them down would be me in that moment. But I think that's when the idea was seeded. And granted, it would take another 8 years before I got the courage to put that stake in the ground and say, okay, this is something I'm doing. And that was 2008. So this image reflects my research travels. I was living in Seattle at the time, and I knew that the most important thing for me in order to unearth and record this family story would be to talk to relatives, right? To get the oral histories, to collect as many as I could. So that's what I did. I started flying around the globe and meeting with family members. And my first stop was to Paris to visit with Felicia, who I just showed you in that photograph. And here we are, Felicia with her husband Louis and my husband Robert, who came with me on all of my research travels in Paris, where Felicia still lives today. And I was equal parts excited and nervous for this interview because Felicia is the only family member living with firsthand memories. And not just that, but it was her childhood memories. Can you even imagine spending your first 7 years of life knowing nothing but the Holocaust and being hunted, being in hiding, pretending to be someone you weren't? So I was very gentle in my approach with her and just blown away by what she was able to remember. I feel like I get questions all the time from readers like, did that really happen with Felicia? Did she really stay under her mother's work table for 10 hours at a time? And did she get hid in that bag of fabric scraps when she was 2? And the scene where she's digging her grave and the escape from the ghetto? And the answer is yes, it's all true. And it's all stories from her mouth. And eventually I started to wonder, maybe some of them were passed down to her from Mila, her mother. And then I realized there were stories that didn't include Mila, that, stories from the convent, or in that bag of paper scraps where Felicia describes the German raid and her mother has to leave her there, and the stomp of the German boots and the floor vibrating under her, and she wets herself and she can feel the paper crinkling when she's breathing. So those are firsthand memories. And now that I have children, I'm like trying to imagine my 2-year-old son staying quiet for a minute, let alone 10 hours or in a bag. So it was a very, very powerful and moving experience being with her, and so grateful for her to be so open with me in her memories, and brave and sharing them.
Georgia, a quick question. Did you have to have special training to be capturing these oral histories, or was this you just said, let's talk, record? I'm just curious sort of how you developed that skill as the writer. I mean, is that something you learned in your training, or?
Well, it's a really good, I've never been asked that question before. And I went into this not as a writer so much but as the, granddaughter of one of the survivors, and sort of more of as the family historian. I didn't know what I was doing. Okay. No, my goal was to preserve the family story. So maybe I looked up some techniques of, questions that you might, I asked very different questions, not just where were you and when and how did you survive, but I was always trying to get to the heart of who the Felicia I know, but like her parents I never met, and that generation, most of whom I never met. So I was asking some kind of quirky questions like, what was their pet peeve, and what was a bad habit, and what was their best habit, and their favorite food and favorite song and things like that, to try to really get to past the just two-dimensional kind of image I had in my mind. But I guess it was more of just a human thing, like trying to gauge what each person was comfortable sharing. And Felicia was the only one that I really worried about that, because like I said, all the other relatives who I interviewed were second generation with no memories. They
Right.
maybe been born during the war, but they were sharing, and it was amazing. The way they shared their stories was with a lot more humor and laughter and anecdotally, which then when I came time to actually write those scenes, I had to remind myself, okay, like this was actually a matter of life or death in this scene.
Right.
It wasn't actually funny that his father had to, disguise a circumcision in that moment, even though that scene was told with a lot of laughter, or that event was told with a lot of laughter. So no, I would say like I created my list of questions, and my mom has been my wing woman throughout every step of every step of the way. So I imagine we looked through them and kind of added to them, and I'd send them ahead of time, and then I had my little voice recorder and just took copious notes. And
Well, it worked obviously beautifully, but I just was curious what
yeah.
that prep work is. I'm sorry for interrupting your narrative and your
Wow,
travels.
that's a really great question. So my next stop was to Rio, to Brazil, and here I am with Gannick's younger son, Michel, at the archives, National Archives, where we found several records for all the family members who came in. And also on the right, a scene from Guanabara Bay, which is the same bay where my grandfather paddles out on a little rowboat, which I imagine might have looked like this, to greet his family who hasn't seen in the better part of a decade. So I loved standing there and looking at that scene, imagining it not looking all that different. And that's probably my favorite scene in the whole book. So having this visual of what it might have looked like was really cool. So little by little, as the bones of my story came together, I realized that there were going to be some pieces that were missing in the narrative. So, for example, my grandfather's journey to reach Brazil, he ended up his ship where he met Eliska, the Czechoslovakian woman who he was engaged to. They got stopped first in Dakar for 4 months, and then again in Casablanca, and then again they were detained in a little island off of Rio. Meanwhile, he had an illegally issued visa that was very expired by the time he reached Brazil. There were boats of refugees being turned away left and right. He'd left everything he knew behind, but he'd also fallen in love, and he was on this ship full of musicians and talented artists, and the whole experience just was like mind-boggling to me. And I wondered, what did it feel like on his first day in Brazil, like when he was actually allowed on free soil? And I didn't have that information, but it was important to me, felt important to include it in the narrative. So when there was a space like that where I didn't have an actual like verbatim in my oral history, I hadn't collected that information, I allowed myself to put on a creative lens and say, could it have happened this way? And so for this, there's a scene in the book where Addie and Elise gets on their very first day in Rio. They walk along Via Atlantica in along the beach on this beautiful cobblestone street. And I knew my grandfather would have admired the cobblestones. And I based that scene entirely around what Robert and I did on our first day in Rio. So there were places like that where I would take that little bit of creative license to fill in a blank, as long as I felt like it could have happened to the best of my knowledge, to all of my research. And that hence played a role in my decision to call it historical fiction as opposed to nonfiction. So even though the bones of the story, who was where and when and how they survived, is absolutely based on truth, some of those more creative details or connective tissue, if you will, is where I brought in the fictionalization piece. When I ran out of family members to interview, I thought, who else might be out there with a story to share that's relevant? And through a very long extensive rabbit hole, I found Eliska, the ex-fiance. And she happened to be living in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. She was 88 years old. And I wrote her a letter, and she actually called me. I left my phone number for her. She called me the day it arrived, and I wasn't sure what mental state she'd be in. I wasn't even sure, I didn't know how exactly she'd left off with my grandfather. I was a lot of unknowns, but she called, and I'll never forget. And she was so excited, and she was so happy that I had reached out. And she said, "Of course, I remember your grandfather. Come visit me. I want to meet you." So my mom and I flew down and spent a couple days with her in Chapel Hill, and she had amazing memories and photos. This is her around the time she met my grandfather. Here we are, obviously together. She had documents about the sailing and the name of the ship that eventually the original ship never made it, past Dakar. So then they had to get across the Strait of Gibraltar and get on another ship. And it was wonderful. But aside from the nuts and bolts of how they got where and when, she was also able to shed sort of that more human piece that I was craving of what it felt like. And that was amazing. And she also had probably one of my favorite things about our visit. My grandfather, when he got to Brazil, before his work papers had cleared, he worked under the table binding leather books by hand. So she had a couple of his hand-bound leather books, and she gave us one. Yeah, it was really, so the whole visit was really special, and her eyes still twinkled and lit up when she talked about my grandfather. I think there was a real romance there. When I asked her, she had nothing negative to say at all, but when I said, "Well, so why didn't it work?" And she kind of said, "Oh, there would have been way too many fireworks. So there were too strong personalities." And then she also left me with a stack of letters that she had written to her best friend back in Switzerland. And through those letters, I was able to kind of insinuate a little bit her, like, kind of very forward thinking, we're starting a new life, new world, everything, and juxtaposed to my grandfather's, he never talked about it, but who I can only imagine never stopped thinking about his family back in Poland and whether or not they were safe. So that was also a really amazing visit. Alongside my oral interviews, I was also collecting as much data and as many records as I could. So that meant often hiring translators to reach out to archives, ministries, magistrates, anywhere that might have a record pertaining to my family. And again, I was amazed at what I was able to find. I recommend if anybody's looking or wants to look into their family history, reach out, because more and more and more records are being digitalized all the time. From lots of different sources. So this was a letter I had written to a ministry in Moscow. It came back to me 11 months later, so you have to be patient. But sure enough, it had a name of a relative and a date of where they had been. And even if it was just that like little nugget of information, it felt like gold. And I would drop it into this huge timeline that I created to try to keep track of everything that I color coded by sibling. So to keep track of who was where and when. I also found this document, which you won't be able to read. It's written in Polish, but I mentioned that Jose's parents, Genek and Herta, so Genek was my grandfather's older brother. The piece of their story where they were sent off to Siberia and eventually ended up in an army was very vague when I went into this. Nobody really knew much about it. And through the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, I was able to find a 9-page document in Genek's hand. So this is one of the pages he's written, in which he describes exactly the reason why he was arrested in Lvov, the day he and Herta boarded a train to east into Russia, into Siberia, the name of their camp, what they were made to do there, the day they were eventually released on amnesty. And Stalin says, "Okay, like Hitler and I have broken ties, all of you Poles, you're free on condition that you fight for me." So then what the year-long exodus entailed to reach Persia, where the Polish army was gathering, and from there on to Italy, where he fought in some incredibly important battles, it turns out. This I actually found through the Ministry of Defense in the UK, because the Polish army fell under the wing of the British army, and the Brits took really great records. And so I discovered I could map out exactly where Genek and it turns out Selim were fighting, and for this army called Anders's army, and also that they had unclaimed medals of honor. So I was able to claim those for them. And the other records that absolutely were a pot of gold for my research were Shoah interviews. So the Shoah Foundation is Steven Spielberg's organization where he put survivors in front of video cameras, and they came to us in like VHS tapes. But I had 3 relatives who were speaking into a camera and telling their stories. And that was an incredible resource as well, of course. Then it came time to write the book. I had all my research, I had my timeline and the bones of my story. And then I, of course, also was collecting as many photographs and documents from the family that people had preserved. And there weren't a ton because the family was on the run, right? They weren't lugging along trunks full of artifacts, but I had a few. So if I did, you can bet that photograph or that sheet music would live verbatim in the book. So on the left here is my grandfather, Addy, during a very short stint in a Polish column of the French army before he left France. So I talk about his uniform and his gun and his marching along with his comrades. And then he was also a composer, and his piece called List, which means letter in Polish, came out before the war. So this piece comes up a lot in the novel. I had this photo that I found of the Alcina, the ship that my grandfather boarded in Marseille, which never made its way to Rio, actually got bombed in Dakar. And so there are scenes aboard this ship in the music lounge and such with Eliska. This is probably my favorite family document. This is Helena, my grandfather's younger sister, so the youngest of the 5. And this is her false ID. So you can see she chose the name Brzoza for her last name, which actually someone at one of my book events told me, who speaks Polish, told me that it means birch tree, and that birch trees in Poland are a source of pride. So I thought that was so interesting that she picked that name, and that I love her expression in this photograph. And I knew she would have used this document really to orchestrate the family's maneuvering in and out of prison, pretending to, obviously posing as Aryan over and over again, that this document saved her life. And I love that, I love her kind of bravado and her courage and her, that kind of look like, don't mess with me in this photograph, which is everything that I was told about her personality in a nutshell. She was the youngest, but also kind of the most defiant. And I loved that about her, that she kind of turned the young defiant one kind of turned into the one who was able to orchestrate the family's survival and safety. This photo, I wrote a scene around this one in the book. This is Genek on the right and his wife Herta in Tel Aviv. So this is right before he goes off to fight in Italy. And I have a scene where they've made a couple of friends from the camp in Siberia who step back and snap a picture. And Herta's wearing this dress and he's wearing his uniform. And this is not passed down from family, but I discovered that Genek's army, Anders's army, the one that traveled thousands and thousands of miles across the Middle East and even into Africa and then to Europe, adopted a bear cub in Persia. And they named him Wojciech, which is Polish for smiling warrior. And sure enough, the bear cub grew into a giant bear over the years. And he was, he pulled wagons and hauled ammunition and drank beers and smoked cigarettes. And there's so much written about him. And he was a real source of morale, I think, for these guys who were starving and, often most of them ex-prisoners of, in the gulag. So I knew he would make a little cameo in one of the chapters as well. And this photograph is a bit haunting, but this was taken by Jacob, my grandfather's younger brother. And here is his wife, Bella, and baby Victor. And this was after the war when they are boarding what looks like a cattle car in Poland, headed to Germany to a displaced persons camp in Stuttgart. And again, with the goal of trying to acquire a visa to eventually move to the States. And I just admire their expression so much in this picture of everything they've been through, and especially Bella, having lost most of her family, and just looking confident and put together and happy, even just kind of jarring when you think about everything that they've been through. So there's a scene in the book where they've boarded the train, they're all ready to go, and Jacob has chills because he can only imagine where this train has been before, and the train is about to pull out, and he hops off and snaps this photo. And then the last piece of my research that I'll walk you through quickly was to travel in the footsteps of my family members. I found it really interesting in my interviews that no one in the family went back to Poland after the war. They ended up in Brazil, and they could have gone back, but no one had any interest in doing so. And so I was a little bit nervous to go back, to be honest. And part of it was I had images like this in my mind of the Rodham ghetto. So this is the wall that they erected, and they, 30,000 Jews inside the walls of this ghetto. And I knew the statistics that of those 30,000 who made up about a third of the population in Rodham before the war, fewer than 300 survived. So just the statistics alone, and what I knew of the Holocaust and Poland's Jews in general made me quite uneasy about the idea. But I also knew without a doubt that I needed to go. I wanted to go. So Robert and I traded in our vacation days and budget for 2 summers in a row, actually, and spent a week hopping around Eastern Europe and then driving down the coast of Italy. And the next photo I'll show you is of the same exact street corner where the ghetto gates once stood. And this is what it looks like 4 years ago when we were there. And so my first impression of this town, Rodham, where I was so nervous kind of to go, was of how beautiful it was and how quaint. This is the main street. My grandparents had a shop, a textile shop. I was struck by how livable it felt, the cobblestone streets, the wrought iron balconies, the poppy flowers. I felt welcome, people were friendly. And it was really nice to have that impression and to imagine, well, why my great-grandparents, Saul and Nahuma, decided to stay, right? Even with the shadow of war growing and things getting worse, they didn't up and leave. And it also to imagine what was life was like for them before their world turned completely upside down. It didn't really feel all that different from Rowayton or one of these little New England towns that we're all familiar with. Here I am at the family's old address. They lived up on the 2nd floor in this building, and people probably thought I was a little crazy. I walked in and out of that doorway 50 times, imagining my family doing the same thing. We had a really amazing guide, Jacob is his name actually, taking us around, and he wanted to show me the place where the synagogue once stood. So this is a rendering of what it once looked like, and today is an empty square. And he told us that then when the Nazis came in, they burned it down. And well, first they used it as a stable for their horses, and then they burned it down. So today it has been preserved as an empty square, and there actually is a small monument there honoring the Jewish history, which is pretty amazing today. That was built after my visit. He also really wanted to show us the Jewish cemetery outside of town. And we found this postcard actually of the cemetery, which is telling in itself that there's a postcard made of it. Clearly there's a lot of pride. The hundreds, if not thousands, of these gorgeous headstones, beautifully kept, ornate. And sadly today, this is what it looks like. And Jacob there in the middle explained that, again, when the Nazis came in, they ripped up the headstones to build an airstrip outside of town. So I had this very kind of double experience of feeling this kind of the warmth of this city and what it was like to live there and why my great-grandparents chose to stay there, but also this kind of chilling sense of being a bit, haunted or, that there were ghosts all around. And so it was a very double experience, but I'm so glad I went. And from there, we drove on through Czech Republic into Austria. We looked at the Alps that Helena crossed over. We did not hike them. We admired her fortitude. And then the next summer we went on, and that summer we brought our little guy who was 4 at the time, Wyatt, to Italy. And so the last leg of the family exodus was really down the eastern, the Adriatic coast of Italy. So we rented a car and did a one-way trip. and took him with us. And this one was a little less research intense, but we did make a few important stops. This one was one of them in Bari, where there was a really important and moving reunion of some family members who hadn't seen each other in years. And it was really special to be there with Wyatt and Robert and walking down the platform and hearing the chirp of Italian on the speakers and watching the trains come and go and kind of imagining Mila and little Felicia being there in the same place some 75 years ago. And that, I can't say Wyatt, again, he was 4. He was definitely more interested in the gelato than in his grandparents. But I'm glad we took him, and he loves looking back at the photos. And then it was it. I kind of was off to the races and put the final at that point I had my manuscript written, but I was able to kind of add some of those more colorful setting details before it went off to print. And yeah, I guess I'll just say, in the end, my goal was twofold. It was to preserve the family history in the best, most accurate way possible, to honor the family members whose stories unfold on the pages, but also to write it in a way that would resonate with Wyatt someday, and now my other son, Ransom, so that they could pick it up and read it and have it not feel so black and white or historic or like ancient history, which sadly that era is already feeling like ancient history to our children, but to feel more visceral and relevant and human. And kind of remembering, even though we see that era in these horrible statistics that are unfathomable and this black and white images, sepia tone images, that the family at the time, they were living in color, right? So as I wrote, I tried to kind of keep that in mind, and I included as much as I could about what was happening in the reality and their world, but also, from a political and military and from the standpoint of being Jews in Poland at the time, but also I tried to include the other pieces of their lives that were still continuing, like somehow they were having children, right. and making music and falling in love and having these moments, small moments of kind of lightness and laughter and beauty that, like, I imagine helped them to preserve that tiny bit of normalcy that in turn gave them the energy to keep putting one foot in front of the other and keep staying one step ahead of the enemy. So that was my goal. I hope someday my kids pick it up and appreciate it. I know my generation, third generation, the families, the feedback has been so positive. Thank goodness. I was most nervous to pass the book along to them, obviously.
That was one of my questions. I wanted to know sort of how you got the book, to them. Was there a sort of special celebration? Did they get advanced looks? What did that feel like when you were sharing it with them?
I thought so hard about that. And so all of the family is very opinionated and in the best possible way. So I purposely did not give them all advanced looks in terms of like giving me feedback and edits. I asked them questions up till the very last second to get to make sure I had everything right. But I sent them the galley. So the galley comes out before the book is published, and it's in hopes of getting a review or a good blurb on the cover. So they got to take an early peek that way. And that's when I really held my breath, but the feedback was amazing. I'll show you one more picture. I have a couple here that I will skip over because I do during my readings, but this photo, so my book came out on Valentine's Day of 2017, and all along I had actually kept a blog, which if you go to my website you can see it, and the blog was a way to kind of keep the family abreast of where I'd been and what discoveries I had made, and that was sort of my personal journey, my piece of it, talk about what those discoveries meant to me. And I kept everybody in the loop. And then as the book was about to be published, and Viking, my publisher, said they put together a little kind of local tour, but it was a good tour, and it started at Barnes and Noble in New York City. And I sent them an email and just like all gratitude, and this could have never happened without you all, and thank you, and can you believe it, the Viking is sending me to New York, and I get to do my first event at a Barnes and Noble, and I'm terrified, but this is amazing. And not in any way expecting any of them to show up. And sure enough, 22 of them showed up. So of the 5 siblings, there were 4 represented that night at Barnes and Noble. It was like 3/4 of the crowd. And then my friends who I wanted to come support me, and a couple of homeless people in the back. So that was like literally like I know I was so overwhelmed with gratitude. It was amazing. But so of the four were there with children, represented by children, grandchildren, and great grandchildren. So
Wow.
that is also just telling of the support that I had and continue to have throughout this project.
Well, George, thank you for that. I have a bookish question about your process because that's the sort of hat that I typically wear. Then I want to open the floor up. But at what point did you go from pulling this information together for family posterity to I have the idea for a book, get an agent, pitch the story to manuscript, right? Like, so everybody's story is different. Did a light bulb go on? Did somebody hear about your project and say you should write a book? What how did that work for you in terms of becoming an author suddenly?
That's a good question. I really did go into it as family historian, but I think the second I started to realize how remarkable this story was, and also like how they survived, and the fact that they all survived, and what a complete statistical anomaly they were.
Right.
I don't know if you guys read the author's note, but at that family reunion in 2000, I'll never forget sitting around, and Felicia looked around at the end of the night and said, "It's really a miracle that we're all here." And then she actually said we were the lucky ones. So obviously that stayed with me. But I started telling people about it a little bit, and they were like, "Oh my God," the reaction was, you have to write this. This has to be a book. Even still, I mean, I agreed it was worthy. And I feel like the whole family, wouldn't you say, Mom, was like, everybody kind of felt like someone needs to write this. Someone needs to write this. So, it's a story worth telling, just for even like the how, right? How they managed to survive. But it took me a long time to share it with anybody, just because it's so personal. And, I felt a lot of pressure on myself just to get it right. So my mom, my husband, and then a dear friend from UVA were the first three people to read it. And they were very kind and gave me nice feedback, helpful feedback. But I also kind of figured they were going to be like, "Oh, your family's story stinks," like, so once I got their feedback and incorporated that, and then I thought, oh, do I want to try to do this? And I thought about just self-publishing it or just sending that to the family. And I thought, you know what, I'm just going to see what happens. And I have a friend here in publishing, and she said, I know a freelance editor and she's awesome. If you wanted to reach out to her. I thought, great, maybe it'd be a smart idea to have somebody who has no connection to me read this and see what they think. So I passed it on to her, and she's amazing. She had worked at Penguin for years and years, and now is doing her own thing, and she loved it, and she gave me great feedback. So I made another round of edits, but she, at the end of our time together, said, I love this so much, and I feel like I know 3 or 4 agents who are just waiting for this kind of family saga to appear on their desk. Could I reach out on your behalf? And that's where I got really lucky, because that's when she kind of made it real. And everyone knows looking for an agent is very challenging. They got the slush pile, they call it. They get so many submissions every day. So because this editor reached out on my behalf, I got to the top of that slush pile, and sure enough, I think like 4 or 5 of the agents all jumped and read it. And my agent, I always say, it's like The Voice. She hit her button like the second she read it, 24 hours later. And we set up a meeting together, and I just knew, I could just tell from her passion and she was just so invested in it from the very get-go that we would work well together. So I signed on with her, and we worked for probably a year on another round of edits. And then it's such a personal world. It's one thing I've learned about publishing. So when she was thinking of who to send it out to the publishing houses, to the specific editors within the publishing houses, yeah, it was like, well, she's a granddaughter of a survivor, and this one, and so she just knew exactly who to send it to. And again, we found an editor at Viking who, just the 3 of us just made an incredible team. So I had my friend Sarah here, who lives in Rowayton, laughs with me because she's the one who recommended the freelance editor. And she's like, this whole process for you has been incredibly easy and positive. Not easy in that it didn't take a lot of work, but she's like, it just doesn't normally happen like this. So I feel so lucky, because it really did. I've realized it's all about trusting and putting your work, your baby, into the hands of the right people. And I found my right people right away.
And yeah, this is, I think also, if I hear you correctly, there was, one round of edits from your family, one round from the editor, another round with your agent, and then probably a fourth, right, with your actual publisher. So
Oh, yeah.
again, as a person who works in books, I just like for people to understand, you don't just write your book and hand it off, do you? Even if you're really lucky and it's as easy as George is making it sound, like that's amazing. And did they help you with that conversation about calling it a novel?
Yeah.
Was that part of crafting your pitch for that? Like, and that was one of the questions before you joined, was your decision to call it a novel.
Yep, I felt really confident in that. Interestingly, and my agent did too, historical novels. I just think they make for great book club reads. And it's, for me, I mean, I personally love historical fiction. So I felt like it was just the right fit. And because I wasn't there to interview any of these family members firsthand, I just didn't feel comfortable putting words in their mouths and thoughts in their brains and things like that. But interestingly, one of the publishing houses that was interested in taking it said they would only publish it as nonfiction, narrative nonfiction, because the story was so unbelievable. They worried people would just discount it as fiction. So I appreciated that. I think that's a compliment in a way to the family's survival. I mean, and how they survived. But for me, I knew I was more comfortable, and my agent and my editor, we were all comfortable with it. And that's why I decided to write a very extensive author's note at the end, to kind of bring my piece of it and how much of research was involved to light for those who were interested in it. But I get a lot of readers who say, I got to the end and realized it was based on a true story and had no idea. And I think that's great.
Yes. And I was saying before you joined also, your reader's guide is really helpful. That's on your website. For those of us that were looking for the like Venn diagrams of your, the sort of family tree. So if you're still interested, it's there. I'd love to hear other questions anybody has for
Why don't I stop sharing so I can see more of you, so I can.
Exactly. More questions for Georgia, please.
So I just wanted to say, I don't really know a lot of history. So I really loved how you put the dates and the things that happened between the characters. That was really, really helpful.
Oh, I'm so glad. Yeah, that was so in my timeline that I created to keep track of my relatives. I was also doing a lot of research of what was happening around them. And because especially at the time, if you were Jewish, like your radio was confiscated, newspapers, like they had no way of knowing what was going on. So I was constantly, so those stories didn't come up like, oh, well, this was the exact date of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, or, I just had to kind of map it out on my own and then overlap it with the stories that were being told. So Helena said she crossed the river and it was freezing cold, so that was probably winter, and Bella was crossing over the German Russian front. And so for me, it was so helpful to have that context of just historically what was going on, that I felt like, well, maybe readers will appreciate it too. So I'm happy to hear you did. And it was a really nice way as a writer to not force that into the story, to not have them like walk by a newspaper stand and read a headline. Instead, I could keep readers in the story, and then kind of use that as like, a way to kind of ground it and add that credibility of what was happening and remind people. But yeah, if you were Jewish and Polish, chances are you didn't really know what was going on around you.
Thanks, Cynthia.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You got that document in your great uncle's hand about his time in the Gulag, and from the Hoover Institute. How did you find that? And how I also have a Polish background and have been researching my family, who was Catholic and suffered horribly during those years as forced laborers under the Third Reich, and then were displaced persons. And like your grandfather's generation spoke not at all of it, and their children really know nothing because their parents said nothing about it. And I don't even know where to begin almost. I found documents that say, that have them in the displaced persons camps, and tiny snippets like, oh, my mother said she picked apples for the Germans. But I don't know how to find anything more beefy than that to weave the story together as you did. And the Hoover Institute letter was amazing.
Well, you could start there. You never know. They have an amazing database there of digitalized records. And I have a page on my website called Ancestry Search Tips with a lot of the links that I used.
Okay.
So start there and look and see if any of them look relevant. I actually got turned on to Hoover and like specifically someone at the Hoover Institution and someone at the Ministry of Defense I like wound my way into a Yahoo group. I don't even know if those exist anymore, but specifically for relatives of survivors from the Siberian Gulag, from the camps. And there are thousands of people. There were like 2,500 people in this group. And so I just kind of put out a group chat and said, hey, I'm looking for information. And sure enough, somebody replied saying, oh, you should reach out. I would have never thought to look at the Hoover Institution. It would never have crossed my mind. So even if you just know those tiny snippets, put it in Google and see if there might be a group out there devoted to either that time or that town or that last name, and obviously International Tracing Service is a good place. And there's a link to that on my site as well. You just have to kind of remember that sometimes town names changed, last names changed. If anything else comes to mind, I will follow up with Nancy or Felicia and let you know, or feel free to just reach out to me on my website. My email is there. But start on the Ancestry page and see if you got any good links that way. And I just say it can't hurt to try. It was just remarkable how many records came back when I just thought there's no trace of these people, no trace. And then sure enough.
Yeah, that's how I feel right now.
But I guess I would say, don't give up. Yeah.
I won't. Thank you. I appreciate the hint.
Jennifer, I think I see your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Georgia, most of your stories are so unbelievably sad and of course the very happy ending, but and did you get angry when you were doing this research, or were the people you interviewed hurt, angry? I just can't. I mean, it was one thing to read this as a reader. It's another thing to read about your own relatives. It must have been really difficult, I would think.
Yeah, that's a good question. It was hard. I think I went through the whole spectrum of emotions writing this. Sad and angry and grateful and happy. And it was interesting though, because for me, perhaps because the way our story ended, and perhaps just because of the sort of personality traits of the second generation, so my mom and her cousins, the stories passed down really, I think I mentioned it, they were done so with levity and almost, anecdotally, and can you believe this? And my father was using hard-boiled eggs to make false IDs, and even in the interviews, the Shoah interviews where I was watching, I was no part of that, but they were, talking into the video camera. Even those stories were told with such kind of distance and stoicism that it was hard to, in a way, to get too wrapped up in the emotion of it, because, and I'm sure that was done on purpose, is like, here's what happened. And that was their way, either protecting themselves or protecting future generations. But when it became really challenging for me is when I had to really step back and put myself in their shoes and in their hearts and minds and imagine, like, in that moment what it felt like to be a mother, telling as you're digging a grave with your daughter and telling her to run across the field and pretend that someone else is her mother. Like, that became really, really hard. And yes, researching it and knowing that those scenes exist was infuriating. And I guess I just kind of used that as fuel and like motivation to tell the story and to preserve it. But especially when I became a mom, that storyline in particular, Mila and Felicia's, became really hard to write.
Just one more follow-up. Who gave the interviews to the Steven Spielberg?
So I had Helena, Felicia, and Bella, who in real life is Marilla.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Any more questions for Georgia? We've got a comment from Alexis who had to leave. She said, "Thank you, Georgia, for sharing your book and your thoughts with us. I have to sign off, but I'm happy to have the opportunity to learn about the background of your book and your efforts in researching your family's journey."
Oh, nice.
So she had to fill out. Do you have a question, Felicia?
Yeah, I mean, first off, thank you, Georgia. This was just phenomenal. And just to read it and to hear your side of it is just, and very personal for me too, as you know, like, because my family's similar history. But
See the photos in the background, actually.
yeah, well, that's actually one side. That's my Polish grandparents' side. But I was just saying, my father right now is actually being interviewed by the UJA for his Holocaust survival story. They're documenting him and I think it's 8 other Holocaust survivors.
Amazing.
And they'll be coming out with some kind of documentary. I don't really understand all the details. My mother's kind of trying to tell me through it, and they've been talking on Zoom, all of them. They don't know each other, but just telling their story, and they're going to meet this weekend. They all had to get COVID tests so they could meet in person and talk about things. But that was just a side note.
Well, that's amazing. Will you send a documentary or link to anything if it's?
Yeah, when it comes out, I have to find out all the details. But yes, I will definitely send it around. But I wanted to know about your next book, or can you talk about it at all?
Yeah.
I remember you were working on something here, but I didn't want to pry too much.
Yeah. So so it was so interesting because back to the question about, when did this become real? The book came out and it was just so well received. It just was kind of blew me away. And then the publisher started asking what's next. And that's when it really became real, because I was like, oh, okay, we're doing this. Then I had a baby, and literally like 5 days after my book tour ended for We Were the Lucky Ones, I took a little pause. And I thought long and hard about what to do next, because this was, at risk of sounding cheesy, this was a calling. This was so personal. This was something I had to do and I wanted to do. So for me to just kind of create something from scratch felt very strange. But then I thought a lot about the themes that were resonating with me and with readers, being ancestry and motherhood. And I thought it actually could be kind of cool to write a story maybe based on 1 or 2 storylines instead of 7. And where I could use my own, kind of create my own plot. And I decided to do that and base it and set it in Italy, Italy and a little bit of Greece, which the more I researched, my mom's been helping me research, it is such a complex story there. So in your mind, I don't know if you guys have it in your mind, like what happened to the Jews of Italy, but I didn't really know. And I knew that like Italy was kind of switching between Axis and Allied. So it's very gray and it's very complex and interesting and sad, but also hopeful. There's all sides of the story there. Those who are being turned in, those who are sent off to the concentration camps, those who are being helped. And so I'm going to use my novel as a way to tell a story about a young woman, and the themes will be ancestry and friendship and motherhood. And she'll be in the North, where you didn't want to be Jewish if you were in the North, where the Axis and Hitler and the Nazis arrived in 43. Things got like progressively worse. And then in 43, the North, if you were Jewish, it was the same as being in the rest of Eastern Europe, Germany and Poland. So she's trying to make her way south toward Allied Italy. And so it'll be a story of survival and, again, friendship and motherhood. And then I'm keep reminding myself I might have an idea of including a second storyline. I'm so deep into the historic one, but I like the idea of including potentially a second storyline and not flip-flopping at every other chapter, but just maybe introducing it in the beginning and the end, where you meet a young woman who's spending some time, more modern days, and spending some time with her grandmother, perhaps in a place that I'm very familiar with. And so I can draw from my own experience there. And over the course of maybe a month together with her grandmother, a family secret is revealed about her ancestry, which kind of changes everything, changes her own identity. And so those two stories will connect. But I'm really excited. I've been like, my parents met in Italy and spent 10 years there. And I did my semester abroad. I have a really special place in my heart for that country. My mom and actually, we were booked to go in April before everything shut down. But I'm really excited to kind of keep diving into the story. I feel like I learned something every day about what was happening there. So that's where I am. Where am I, Mom? I'm like 20 chapters in, maybe. Yeah.
Maybe we could have our book group in Italy when that comes out.
Right?
Okay,
Yeah.
maybe we could be we could organize that. Well, we will be your beta reader group in Italy if you need like scenario
Awesome.
setting.
I do.
set us up
It's
for that.
on. Yes.
Well, Georgia, quickly before we thank you for being so generous and gracious with your time, I want to sneak in a question about the movie rights. Was it movie rights? Is it TV rights? What does that look like in terms of who will be playing all these characters, or how much control do you have over that, or is it you have to not talk about it until it's
No, I can talk about it. So I feel like it's somewhat of a dream come true, and it's still, let's just be like, it's a very small chance that this will actually come to fruition. However, it's in the hands of really great people. My friend Tommy approached me maybe like 2 years ago now. So Tommy, I met through my husband Robert. They went to camp together from when they were like 10 years old. I met him when I was 20. So right around that family reunion time. Tommy has been in, like, we were going to his plays. He was directing plays in like the basements of churches in the city. And then little by little, he worked his way up to directing Hamilton. So, and now he has his own production company and he is so crushing it, right? And it's so fun because we've been into In the Heights, and he's did Fosse Verdon on FX. And I mean, it's amazing. He's now married to Michelle Williams. They have a baby. Like, it's just kind of surreal. So he called and was like, hey, buddy, like, let's do this together. And I thought he was almost joking because it just felt too good to be true. So I get to work with him and his production team. They they presented me with a whole long list of names of screenwriters, and I met with a few, and we picked one who's amazing, who I absolutely adore. So we have created a pitch together, and now we're in the process of pitching it to the networks. We went out last summer, and it was probably one of the most fun things that's happened with this book, because it was the first time I sat in a room, just sitting in a room at Netflix with like people in the drama department or HBO or Apple. And, but I got to hear Erica, my screenwriter, telling the story for me. You know, obviously I said a quick hello and Tommy said hello and my connection, whatever, but like she was there telling 30 minutes of this very deep, involved pitch about my family story. And so it was really, really amazing to hear that. And then the executives in the room who were so, like, Tommy had warned me, like, by the way, they're going to check their watches and peace out if they're bored, and just don't be offended. That happens all the time. They would spend 45 minutes asking me questions after these pitches, you know, like, so interested. So it was amazing. None of them picked it up. So now here we are again. And the only kind of difference now that we're going into our second round of pitches is Tommy is now signed on with 20th Century Fox, and they optioned it. So it wasn't a guarantee. Like, he brought all of his projects to them. So now I have a production company behind us. So when we go to pitch, we've got Tommy and his team, and we've got our screenwriter, and we also have a production company saying, like, if a network picks it up, we're ready to go. So we'll see. It's going to happen, I think, maybe in a few weeks. I was just practicing today, actually. We had a run through of our pitch this afternoon. So
wow, very exciting.
Yeah. So we'll see. It's totally surreal, kind of like no expectations, but if it happens, I do feel like I will have some, not control, because I don't feel like I know what I'm doing in that arena, but I'll be able to be a consultant, and I'll feel like it's not going to be in the hands of somebody who's going to exploit it in any way. So
yeah, it's fascinating that you've gotten to be so involved in the process, because that's not always the case for authors, right? Like,
yeah, no, I don't think so at all. Yeah.
That's exciting. Well, before we say goodnight, what's the best way for people to reach you or stay in the loop with you, to sort of stay on the journey with you?
Yeah, you can follow you can go on my website, georgiahunterauthor.com. and sign up for newsletters, blog posts, which I don't do very often or at all at the moment. But if and when something comes up with a TV series, I will certainly post it. I am also on Instagram and Facebook under Georgia Hunter, and I do post to those my events and things like that. So yeah, that's an easy way.
And Facebook, because our Joanne, who's joining us from New Hampshire, is literally from your Facebook page. She's
that's awesome.
Literally, exactly. So keep posting. You're drawing from beyond the Connecticut area.
Oh, that's so great. Oh, fun.
And Melissa just typed in, it was so interesting. We want to go back and reread the book. Your book sounds fascinating. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your time. This is awesome. So check the chat. Lots of praise.
I will.
All for your time. This was such a treat. What a gift.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks, guys, for the invitation to come, and Felicia. I'm always honored. It's always a pleasure to talk about it. And thanks, Mom, for joining us too.
Exactly. So, and thank you. So that was it. We
so
loved
much.
having the 2-for-1 special tonight.
Yeah, right.
Really honored.
This was great.
Well, everybody stay well and warm and have a happy Thanksgiving.
And healthy. Yeah.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So much for
Thank
inviting me.
you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.